Good morning, everyone. It is Wednesday, May 15th, 2024. My name's Ian. I've got Jen and Finn with me here today. And welcome to another episode of Coastal Drone Weekly Live. This week, we're going to be talking about the KP Index. It's kind of on point since we had a little bit of a storm activity last week. Finn's going to walk us through what is the KP Index and what are the concerns that we should have as drone pilots.
We're going to talk about what the KP Index is, how to check the KP Index, and then can you fly? A question that everyone was probably asking over the weekend, can I fly my aircraft with a high KP Index? First, we have to talk about what the K Index is. So the K Index is just a measure of electromagnetic disturbance in Earth's magnetic field. Most of this is caused by the sun, so we had some solar activity, solar flares, and then that sends some particles to the Earth. When those particles hit the Earth, it messes with the magnetic field. So disturbances in the magnetic field we measure as the K Index. But we normally don't talk, especially in drone flying, we don't talk about the K Index, we talk about the KP Index, which is the planetary K Index. The planetary K Index is just an average. There's, I think, 13 satellites that can measure the K Index, so they average it over the planet, and that becomes the planetary K Index. Amount of electromagnetic disturbance averaged across the whole planet.
So this is coming from a CME, or a coronal mass ejection, so a solar flare, right? So the Earth is constantly being hit by solar wind or solar electromagnetic radiation coming from the sun. It hits the Earth like a wave, and then that wave gets pulled in by our gravitational field, hits both poles. So normally you only see aurora borealis or aurora australis on the south side at the poles. So it's pulled into the magnetic poles.
That's why we saw some aurora. And the other one you might hear is the G Index. The G Index is put by the NOAA, America's Environment Canada.
Weather Authority.
Yeah, it's their weather authority. And they were forecasting a geomagnetic storm, and they use the G Index. Now, the G Index is kind of similar to you might, when there's a hurricane, you might get a Category 4 hurricane. Well, you might get a Category 3 or a G3 geomagnetic storm. And so over the weekend, they forecast a severe storm. From what I could gather, we actually only made it up to a strong storm, so a G3. So in the G3, you can see voltage corrections may be required, so this is for power stations, and false alarms triggered on some protection devices. If it were to get to the point of a G4, widespread voltage control problems and things on power grids could trip or mess up. Transformers could act weird, stuff like that. One of the things that is potentially relevant to us, as you can see in the other section, satellite navigation, low-frequency radio navigations, and high-frequency radio may be unreliable, which those are the things that could potentially affect us, not just as drone pilots, but coming up here, you can see how it could affect other types of aviation. What does a high KP index mean? Well, it means that low and high frequency radio and GPS might be unreliable. So high frequency radio is a specific band. It's not just some frequencies are low, some frequencies are high. High frequency is a specific megahertz block. Generally in drone flying, we don't use the high frequency band. We use the super high frequency band. And then for manned aircraft, a lot of navigation is done in the very high frequency band. So it goes high frequency, very high frequency, ultra high frequency, super high frequency.
HF is under 100 megahertz. VHF is 100 and something, and then UHF is into the multi-hundreds, and then SHF is getting into the gigahertz.
Mm-hmm. So drone controllers, they use super high frequency, which is similar bands that Wi-Fi uses. So Wi-Fi was reliable over the weekend-ish.
The higher the frequency is, the less propagation a signal's going to have, right? So we talk about, when we look at command and control links, you're always going to lose your video first when you're flying a drone, because the video signal is usually on the 5.8 gigahertz band or now the 6 gigahertz band. That stuff doesn't penetrate walls or buildings or anything like that. It's not going to do as well because it's going to go into lower areas because it can't penetrate. Or you're going to lose signal first. So lower frequencies in the VHF band, like airplanes, they often will bounce off the atmosphere and come back down, but they actually have very long reach.
A VHF radio that we use in an aircraft, that's line of sight. There's a type of radio nav aid called an automatic direction finder, and that's actually in the same band as AM radio, so that's a low frequency band. those frequency bands, you can actually access it beyond line of sight. The higher frequency for the radio, it's all line of sight.
What does it mean? Well, higher frequencies basically are more susceptible to interference. Super high frequencies, they probably would have not propagated far enough to be a factor anyway, because the reality of what we're talking about right now, though, is most solar storm activity hits the ionosphere or hits the upper atmosphere and is dissipated because of the Earth's magnetic field. The magnetic field is what protects us from solar radiation. Otherwise, we'd all be fried. So the stronger the magnetic field is, the more protection we have, and also the less impact that it necessarily has on us. So when you see aurora borealis in the sky, that's the ionizing radiation hitting our magnetic field and basically getting obliterated by it.
This is how some of the high KP index, this is how some of it affected us. So we got this NOTAM for the Vancouver region. Due to the solar storm, LPV, LP, and WAS-based LNAV and VNAV approaches may not be available. So these are GPS approaches for IFR aircraft. They said that they could potentially be unavailable. Now, I didn't actually hear or see that any of them were unavailable. I have some friends who are at airlines, and they said that they didn't actually notice anything different. So possible that GPS might have been unreliable enough that you couldn't use these GPS approaches. So WAS, when you see WAS, that's like a way of measuring how accurate GPSs are at a given moment.
Yeah, it's an augmented system.
So how do we check the KP index? Well, we as humans, we don't have our senses. We cannot detect changes in the magnetic field. You need to find an external source for KP information. So there's a couple of places where you can check it. You can go to spaceweather.gc.ca, the NOAA space weather, which is what we mentioned earlier, or for drones, we have UAV forecast. So we've just got some screenshots loaded up. So for space weather, they do it by region. I grabbed all these screenshots yesterday, so this was after the event, so you can see that in the last hour, it was quiet, and both forecasts were quiet. And then this is NOAA space weather as well, and you can see that also yesterday it was relatively quiet with some higher areas at some point.
Petering off of the historicals.
Yeah, exactly. And then the one that most of you are probably familiar with is UAV forecast, but you can see that it has the KP information. So there's the KP information on the desktop version, and then on the mobile version, it's at the bottom in the center. You can see the KP information.
Whole lot of screenshots of 9+ on Facebook over the weekend.
Yes. I was checking periodically. On my deck, it never got above 7. Can I fly with a high KP index? There are three kind of major points that I wanted to discuss when we're talking about the question, can I fly with a high KP index? So we'll kind of dive into these things that could potentially dissuade you from flying. So the first one is regulatory, 901.31. This states that you cannot contravene any or the manufacturer's instructions. So what does that mean? If your drone's manual has a KP limit, it says max KP. If the KP is higher than that, then you cannot fly. It is considered in manned aircraft, we would call it a contravention of the pilot operating handbook. But basically, if you violate anything, it's the same thing as you're not going to go flying. If your drone says maximum 10 meters per second, you're not going to go flying in 12 meters per second.
Or rain or wind.
Or rain or whatever.
It's
It's the same thing. It's an environmental factor, and you can't go against it if it's in the manual. However, I looked at a couple of manuals. I looked at the manual for the Mavic 3, and I looked at the manual for the Matrice 350, and neither of them had a KP index limiter. So at least the DJI drones that I looked at didn't have this thing. That doesn't mean that it's never going to happen in the future. That doesn't mean that it's the same for all drones across the board. You'll have to check your drone's manual. And then if the drone's manual says maximum KP index of 5, you couldn't have gone flying over the weekend because that would have been against the manufacturer's recommendations, which those are written in stone. You cannot.
But so if it doesn't say anything and you go flying and you do have an issue, would you end up just chalking that up to, like, would that be considered a factor at that point? Like, are you being negligent then, or?
Yeah, well, you kind of going back to 900.06 as well, because at the end of the day, you need to be responsible for the drone. If the manual doesn't state something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a get out of jail free for that. Yeah. You need to know your airframe and know how it's going to act and what the circumstances are going to be with.
Exactly. It's the same as anything else. You're the pilot in command. The final safety of the flight is ultimately your responsibility. GPS accuracy. So we talked about the GPS approaches. Those need to be quite accurate. The other things that need accurate GPS is geosurvey, that sort of thing. If you're trying to do a mapping mission where you need 0.2 centimeters of accuracy, maybe a day with a high KP index is not the day for that. It might be not super reliable. It might not be as accurate. And as we say in all of these data-driven things, garbage in, garbage out. If you get maps on a day with a high KP index and GPS is crap, then that map is going to be basically worthless.
One thing to remember with the KP as well is imagine that you're dinghy in a storm, right? Because the reality is when you're in a geomagnetic storm, it's not a constant signal, like a constant sine wave of noise coming at you. It's going to be pulses with varying amplitude. So it's like waves coming at you. You're going to have big waves and then you're going to have small waves. So it's not going to be consistent, even if it's forecasted at 6. It could be 6, it could be 2, it could be 12, it's an average or a root mean square.
Yeah, exactly. And if you were out looking at the aurora on Friday night, you probably noticed like it would come and then it would go. There was like a couple 10-minute blocks where it was like the entire sky was purple, and then a couple of 10-minute blocks where it looked completely like nothing had ever happened.
So GPS accuracy is going to lean into quite a bit, and then it's going to talk about the safety assurance declaration of drones as well.
Yeah, and then the other thing would be the safety of bystanders and obstacles. So if you're operating in a tight area, if you're only a basic pilot and you need to maintain the 100 feet, or if your drone isn't able to fly over people, remember, any flight within 5 meters of someone is considered a flight over them. So if you need to be super accurate, if you're in a super tight space or you're in an area with a lot of obstacles, telephone wires, trees, that sort of thing, if you've ever taken off indoors and the drone comes up and you see it drift left, drift right because it can't get a GPS lock, potentially it could do the same thing. It could be drifting left, drifting right because it can't get a GPS lock. They have the obstacle avoidance, the downward facing sensors, but if you were over something where it couldn't really see it, or if it was darker, then you might have some issues with getting a strong GPS signal. The drone could wander back and forth.
So in the absence of GPS, most DJI drones have at minimum a downward facing vision system, and it's a very basic pair of cameras or even one camera that is looking at the ground and looking at the motion of the image. So if the image is drifting right, it's going to move the drone to the right to cancel out that motion. It's very basic, just looking at which way did the pixels go. And if it can't detect differences or contrast, then it has no way of knowing what direction it's going. So it'd have no system for stability.
Yeah, so if you're over water, if you're over a big gravel field where everything is just the same, it's all just noise to the camera, it's not going to have a good time.
Mirrored surfaces, gloss surfaces, water, anything that's got no contrast is going to be the hardest. And so if you're working in the dark, in most situations, especially if your drone doesn't have a landing light, for example, it's going to be very drifty when you get close to the ground. Because and this is even in normal low KP levels, as soon as your drone descends below, let's say 3 meters, I don't know the exact number, but 3 meters is roughly 10 feet. Once you get below that altitude above ground or height above ground, it reverts to using the vision system. And because GPS accuracy at a low angle to the ground is very low, meters instead of centimeters, especially in the dark. That's why you'll see anything that's bigger than 250 grams, like the Air, the Mavic series, they all have landing lights and they automatically come on in low light because the vision system camera is like, wow, it's way too dark. I can't see what I'm doing. It'll turn the landing light on in the dark. The other part of this safety assurance declaration. So we've talked about bystanders and obstacles, right? The minimum distance from people. The other one is, this goes back also to 90131. If your drone, in order for a drone to be compliant to fly in controlled airspace, it needs to have a minimum GPS accuracy of plus or minus 15 meters, 10 horizontally, 15 vertically. That's a pretty big box, realistically. These days, like most drones are good to 1 meter to 3 meters, I think it is, like in a normal GPS environment. But so 10 and 15 is a pretty big box, but it is a minimum requirement. And that is based on ideal conditions, right? So low KP levels, all the satellites being locked is where that is going to happen. In a high KP index environment, that box on the drone, let's say it is 3 meters, it's probably going to grow to 15, 20, maybe more. You don't know unless you have a way of testing that for GPS accuracy. And the only way that you'd be able to test it is to get a real-time high precision decimal feed out of the GPS sensor on your drone to know exactly what it is. If you wanted to fly in controlled airspace with one of these drones at a high KP level, you're probably invalidating your safety assurance declaration, right? You're beyond whatever was specified in the manual of what the rated GPS accuracy
Like normally
is.
you're probably within the box, but
Yeah,
you're saying
totally.
at this
Yeah.
point,
Because the manufacturer says this thing's good enough to fly in controlled airspace because it complies with the minimum standard. The other one we talked about in surveying, if you're doing high precision survey of embedded GPS data, like you said, you're not going to be able to take that data and build a meaningful survey out of it because your error is going to be massive. It's already quite big when you survey something without using ground augmented GPS or PPK that we've talked about in mapping before. If you just rely on the GPS built into the drone, it's not accurate enough to get a reliable map and make things easy to tie together. You're invalidating the value of your survey. You shouldn't fly. I talked about this on Facebook a little bit over the weekend. If the GPS accuracy isn't good enough to get a meaningful survey data out of it, don't fly. If your safety assurance declaration is now invalidated because you're beyond, don't fly if you need to fly in controlled airspace. If you're near bystanders, like you said, don't fly. However, and this is where we're leading to, if you're in a basic environment, if you're flying a drone that doesn't require a safety assurance declaration, like a Mini, for example, or you're not anywhere near any bystanders or people that are open air assembly, and if you can confirm that flight functionality is good, signal strength is good, and everything is operating for the duration of the flight, then you start looking at it from a risk assessment point of view and whether or not it's going to be something that you can safely execute. And that's really what it is. This is all leading towards making an appropriate risk assessment for your flight. Is any kind of flight safety going to be compromised? Well, that's something you got to look at from where you are. If you're in a Class G basic environment, probably fine. Do an assessment of the area around you. One thing I noticed on Friday night, lots of airplanes flying around. So that all said, on Friday night, I decided to fly both the Mavic 3 and the Mini 3 Pro. Where I flew them was a basic environment, right? So it's Class G airspace. I know the area very well. It's over top of my house. I have a pretty safe environment. The only thing about where I live is it is common for traffic to kind of transit over top in training flights, but they're typically at 1,000 feet or higher, potentially lower, but easy for me to accommodate. I set my drone's limit to 90 meters altitude. It wasn't high enough to be a concern. 90 meters is still well below the 120 meters. That would be 400 feet. Let's take that away. We're at 300 something feet. Yeah. Fired it up, did a compass calibration before it departed because it did ask for that. I do have rebar in my driveway as well, which is a problem. So you always have to be careful about when you do a compass calibration that you don't fire up on top of rebar and then you got to do the drone dance again because that's going to interact with the drone as well. No issues of GPS accuracy at all. Actually, I did expect to see GPS degrade. The reality is the functionality you're going to lose with GPS is you're going to lose potentially return to home. So you have to maintain visual line of sight at all times, of course, but especially so when you need to monitor where the drone is. No problems at all. And realistically, I had 32 satellites for both drones. So I had multiple networks because we only have like 13 on the horizon, I think, at any time for ours.
What Ian's talking about, so GPS is actually a brand.
Yeah, it's a US brand.
It's the US brand. There's also Galileo, which is the European one, Baidu, which is the Chinese one, and then there's a Russian one as well. And DJI drones are able to actually access they're able to access Baidu, Galileo, and GPS. Yeah. The proper term for this is actually GNSS.
Yeah,
and
Global
GPS
Navigation Satellite Service.
Yeah, and then GPS is a brand. So
it had 32 birds locked, which is a solid because you only really need 13 to get full 3D differential lock.
From a theoretical standpoint, you need 4. You need 4 if you're an aircraft. You need 3 if you're a car. And then you need, I think, it is around 13 to get like a very accurate.
Most DJI products, the reason I say 13 as well is I think that's when the GPS strength indicator goes from yellow to white is around 13.
Yeah, if you look in the manual, I think it recommends around 13.
So solid GPS from a operator's perspective, aircraft flew perfectly fine. I was actually able to take off and then use a hyperlapse using waypoints. So what I do is I fly the drone to point A, move it over to point B, and then set the amount of frames interpolated between it. So I want this to be a 6-second hyperlapse at 24 frames a second or whatever. It's going to be X amount of time. So it would take 10 to 15 minutes. because I only had so much battery. I was only able to get most of it. And I actually let it fly until it went right to return to home. But my point A and point B were within like 15 degrees of where I took off from. So it was very tight. I had line of sight of it the entire time. So even when it went into return home, it actually went exactly to where it was. And the Mavic 3 and the Mini both landed within a foot of where it took off from. So very solid GPS performance, which is like, we're not trying to throw out everything we're saying here, but we're trying to be realistic about in a basic environment, it worked fine. So this is the first one. I used the raw DNG hyperlapse capability on both the drones. And what that lets you do is it will create a 4K video file, but it's going to be processed internally on the drone. So the image quality, the colors aren't going to really be, because the reality is like aurora to the naked eye is in most normal circumstances, you're going to be fighting ambient light in the city and light pollution. And if you haven't tuned your eyes to look for it, it's going to just look like clouds or a little bit of haze. Friday night was so spectacular. It's the most I've ever seen it to be like overcoming ambient light. I was basically standing under a street light and I was able to see it plain as day. And I'm so blown away with what phones can do these days. Like I was able to actually film it video wise, just handheld video, the aurora, which I've done a lot of aurora photography in like the territories years ago. Never could have done that before. And then this is another one. It's also a hyperlapse. This one I set up. It's another A to B point, but I also introduced a rotation in it because I went from east to west so that it would follow the arc of the aurora over. So I didn't get enough frames out of the Mavic 3 because the battery was so low to make it worth. Like it would have been like 2 seconds. So the first one was one pack on the Mini 3 at like 60%. And then the second was like, I think I had another 60% battery. Of course, I charged everything for Saturday night and nothing showed. So the color of the aurora is determined by the oxygen and the altitude of it. So it's based on the different types of atmosphere that the aurora is hitting. So as it penetrates lower or higher, it's going to have different colors. And honestly, that's the pinkest I've ever seen it personally.
Yeah, like normally greens. I'm from Manitoba, so we see it quite often. I'm from a small town, but the pinks we would only get once in a while. But I saw people see purples too. Like I've never seen those before.
Yeah, and that was 10-minute exposure, I think it was. So one thing we could do in the community is we could dump some of the DNG files so you can see what the raw versus the processed version was. I put this all together into, again, DaVinci Resolve, which is a free video editor. You can drag and drop an entire folder full of DNG files into it. It automatically creates a time lapse, and then you can automatically adjust the color for the entire set of photos or exposures.
Right. So if you didn't like the drone's internal processing, you could just do it yourself.
Totally. And then you can scale or crop it. So when these were all shot, they're actually shot in a 4:3 square ratio. And then I just applied a little bit of a stretch to it to make it look like 16:9. Bernie in the chat saying that Mini 2 and Mini 3 recommend a minimum of 10 satellites for GNSS lock. Maya said, yeah, there was tons of crewed aircraft flying Saturday night as well. And someone had some issues on Friday night testing their drone. Michelle says some dumb RPAS pilot flew during a 10 kp in an extreme fire incident area. Well, that's a problem. And in a controlled airspace without permission on their own. So that's multiple problems.
Yeah,
with
now we're on to the second hand of counting cars violations.
We said it last week. We'll probably keep saying it for the next many episodes, but it is wildfire season. Do not fly your drone near wildfires.
5 nautical miles.
Yeah.
I'm looking at you. There's a thing that people talk about called your personal limits. So we always ask about your personal limits. And one of my friends who went for a interview with an airline, one of the questions that he got was, if you're flying day VFR, what are your personal limits for visibility and ceiling? This is a completely bogus question for an airline because they never fly day VFR. They would absolutely, under no circumstances, fly day VFR. But they wanted to gauge his ability. We call this pilot decision making. They wanted to gauge his pilot decision making. What I've noticed in drones is because of the way the regulations are set up, there's less wiggle room for traditional pilot decision making. This is a scenario where this is totally pilot decision making. This is not illegal. This is not against the cars per se, but it comes back to 006. If you make a bad pilot decision, is that negligence? Is that recklessness? Is that carelessness? This weekend was a great opportunity for newer pilots to kind of hone their pilot decision making and find where their comfort level is, find what their personal limits are. If someone called me and said, I don't really feel comfortable flying with a KP index of 7, I would say, well, then that's fine. This is your call. You are the pilot in command. The safety of the flight is your responsibility.
Well, I guess we'll kind of wrap it a little earlier this week. We're not, like I said, we're not trying to say you can or can't. We're trying to say these are the risks. These are the hazards. It's going to be ultimately up to you as pilot in command, whether it's safe to fly and is it worth it? Like I said, anytime if you guys have any questions, you're welcome to put them into the discussion under this in the community and or in the YouTube feed as well.
Get in the comments.
Yeah. Share your experiences with us. We'd love to hear about it. Thanks again for joining us this week. Finn says like and subscribe. Make sure you hit that button. We appreciate you joining us. Yes, and actually that's true. The majority of our audience are not subscribers, and we would really appreciate if you hit that subscribe button. Help us grow the channel. If you find this content useful and or at least entertaining, make sure you hit that button because you will get notified. We come out with the new episodes every week on Sundays. Anyway, we'll be back next week with something new, drone related and relevant. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next week. Bye.